Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark David Smith, as you can probably see by my little tag right here. And you're watching Contemplation. Hey, let's start over. Hey, everybody. let me try this, okay? Today is January 13th, and today is history in the making. We are living through what I believe will be looked back upon as one of the most important times in not only United States history, but one of the most important times in world history. My name is Mark David Smith, and you're watching Contemplating the Constitution on the Lamb Video Network. Now, for our Constitution in the news, when the Constitution of the United States shows up in the news, every once in a while I get an email from my North Carolina Congressman, David Rouser, on last week's Our Constitution in the News. I use this email as the base outline for my article, and this week I've chosen to do the same, basically to use his email as the base outline, and I'll insert my comments as I go along. His latest email is titled The Tragedies of January 6th, by Congressman David Rouser, and it's published January 7th, 2021. My North Carolina Congressman David Rouser writes, and I quote, "I hear from so many who say, I don't know who or what to trust anymore. Trust is foundational for any civilized society and for a representative democracy in particular. When people lose trust in our institutions of government, everything begins to break down. Then mob rule and chaos fill the vacuum. The rule of law is only as good as our character and our ability as a society to enforce it. That's the reason why we have a government in the first place, to secure and protect us from mob rule. It's also why confidence in our elections is so critically important. It's impossible to trust in government institutions if you don't believe they are legitimate and serving the people. What we all witnessed this past week on January 6th in our nation's capital was appalling and should be condemned. Congressman David Rouser continues, based on some of the interviews I saw of those protesting peacefully, many have a deep-seated distrust in our government institutions. This by no means excuses the thuggery and violence of those who participated in the assault on the Capitol. They should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Distrust is why 39% of this country believe the election was rigged, according to a recent Reuters poll, including 17% of Democrats. Some say that is because President Trump has said it was rigged. I have no doubt that there are those who think that because he has said it, because Trump said it, but there are also many smart, independent-minded voters who have instinctively come to that conclusion on their own. Moi is one. This brings me to the formal certification of the electoral votes of each state by Congress. The debate, January 6th of last week, a week from today, was over a constitutional question. A key reason why 39% of the country believe the election was rigged is this. The changes made by states to their election laws in the last few weeks and days leading up to the election day were made by individuals and third parties, not by state legislatures, as the Constitution requires. And many of those changes made fraud that much easier. For those of you who missed last week's article, let me read the part of the Constitution David Rouser is talking about. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution says, and I quote, "Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislator thereof may direct." Rouser's point here is that the state legislator and the state legislature alone can change anything having to do with the election. An individual cannot change the time and place of how it's done. The North Carolina congressman goes on to say, human nature is sinful. So it is inherent that every election has some fraud. It's just a question of how much. Those of us who objected to the certification of electors of certain states and then voted in favor of those objections believe those specific slates of electors are invalid. Why? Because those elections were not conducted based on laws passed by the state legislature and therefore are unconstitutional. In fact, Pennsylvania's state house and Senate each sent Congress a letter requesting we delay certification of their state of electors. Due to irregularities, their hearings have brought to light as a result of such changes. Those on the other side of this argument read the Constitution to say that Congress has no role in evaluating states of electors unless a state submits more than one slate from which to choose. Both arguments are wrong. However, I find it unlikely our Constitution requires each I read that wrong. Both arguments are strong, not wrong. I apologize for that. However, I find it unlikely our Constitution requires each legislative body to officially certify slates of electors. If our founders had intended for this to be a ministerial or clerical function, had that been the case, the Speaker of House or some other governmental office would have been designated. This document identifies the specific sections of the Constitution, as well as Supreme Court rulings that support this view. The objections made on January 6th were on solid constitutional grounds and deserve to be known and understood. Unfortunately, the tragic events of that day obscured this constitutional point, so central to election integrity. This has been from an email sent to me by North Carolina Congressman David Rouser. I saw the whole speech of my President Trump spoke on January 6th, and it was good, but he did not incite anybody to riot or to insurrection or anything of that sort. The actual speech was good. It was lengthy. I've been told several things about it, that they actually even made it go long for specific reasons or whatever. And yes, he did say, now it's time to go march down the streets and go to Congress, but he never incited anybody to violence or anything like that. As a personal commentary, I believe that there's a couple of things that I think should have been foreseen. And first of all, I have trouble believing, let's put it that way. I have trouble believing that with all President Trump's advisors and people that are so smart in putting all of this together and figuring all this out that they couldn't have foreseen that this would happen. I mean, not that the Trump supporters would become violent. I mean, obviously, we haven't in the past. Only Democrats have really been violent in the past. Just take a look at 4 years ago. Why couldn't they have foreseen that there would be people like the ones that did the violence would do it, and have Trump say from the stage, please don't do this. As a matter of fact, if there's a possibility of that, then disperse the crowd and call it a victory and call it a great speech and disperse the crowd and everybody go home and not have that happen. Why couldn't they have foreseen that possibly could have happened? There's just so many things there. Another thing is that he spent 20 minutes or more listing off each individual thing that was wrong with the election, all the different things that had happened. Example, the only thing that usually comes to my head, even though it was 20 minutes worth of different things, that like 139% of the registered voters in Detroit voted. 139%. It would have been great at 100%, but you had 39% of all the voters that weren't even registered to vote. So right away, that's wrong. And it just adds up and adds up. To me, why wouldn't his advisors, why wouldn't his speechwriters add to that to have Trump tell everybody that, I understand this is wrong, but please don't let this incite you to violence. Just understand what it is. And I don't know, these thoughts have gone through my head. It's like Trump is smart, his advisors are smart. I just think they could have handled it differently as far as his speech was concerned. And then if people broke into Congress and broke windows and things like that, then you have Trump publicly saying not to do that. So the ones that did it, it's on them, not on Trump. I'm just so surprised that they didn't head this off before it actually happened. So there you go. There are multiple articles about this subject, and I'm sure it will go on and on. But for now, I'm done with this particular subject until the next one frustrates me, and then I'll probably bring the next one. So let me jump to my next article here, which is an article from theblaze.com. Last Sunday, January 10th, 2021, this article came out and was titled, "Liberal Law Professor Jonathan Turley Warns of the Damage Democrats Would Do to the Constitution If They Impeach Trump Again." The article was written by Chris Enlow and it is from a statement by Jonathan Turley, and I quote, "This would do to the Constitution what the violent rioters did to the Capitol and leave it in tatters." And basically, unquote. Basically, he's talking about, once again, if they tried to impeach Trump again, which is an ongoing process. And this article was from last Sunday, January 10th. And let me go through this just to give you an idea of what Jonathan Turley is saying, which is very viable for today. Wednesday the 13th, January 13th, 2020, still viable. But when I get done with this article, I've added another article that just came out about 10 hours about Pence, Vice President Pence, and the impeachment proceedings. So anyway, once again, Jonathan Turley, a professor at George Washington University Law School and self-described liberal, warned Saturday that Democrats would damage the Constitution if they impeach President Donald Trump over the deadly riots at the U.S. Capitol last week. After the riots, Democrats and many Republicans placed blame for the violence on Trump. Now, Democrats are pushing an expedited effort to impeach Trump for a second time. In fact, according to Washington Examiner, 180 House Democrats support impeaching Trump for willfully inciting violence. Now, may I interject here once again that on my last article, I said that I'm surprised that Trump's advisors didn't foresee what would happen and have Trump head that off before it happened and tell people from the stage not to incite violence, not to do this, not to, if you're going to march on Congress and you're going to come up to Congress, then stay behind the barricades, stay out front, and all that type of thing. So I'm actually surprised that they didn't foresee that this was going to happen. Anyway, going on, indeed, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said on Friday that if Trump does not resign, the House will immediately begin impeachment proceedings against him. However, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell indicated in a memo circulated among Senate Republicans that even if the House does impeach Trump, the Senate will not have time to hold an adequate trial prior to President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20th. All these things add up. It's like, how stupid can you be on the Democrat side? According to the constitutional law professor, Jonathan Turley, and I quote, Democrats will gut the Constitution's free speech protections and its impeachment standard if they move to impeach Trump over last week's violence, unquote. Turley explained in an essay for The Hill, and I quote, the author Franz Kafka once wrote, and I quote, my guiding principle is this: guilt is never to be doubted, unquote. Democrats suddenly appear close, once again, with Turley saying Democrats suddenly appear close to adopting that standard into the Constitution as they prepare for a second impeachment of President Trump. With seeking his removal for incitement, Democrats would gut not only the impeachment standard, but also free speech, all in a mad rush to remove Trump just days before his term ends, end quote. Democrats are seeking to remove Trump on the basis of his remarks to supporters before the rioting at the Capitol. This quote from the writer of this article, Chris Enlow, like others, I condemn those remarks as he gave them, calling them reckless and wrong. I also oppose the challenges to electoral votes in Congress, but his address does not meet the definition for incitement under the criminal code. It does not. It would be reviewed as protected speech by the Supreme Court, Supreme Court, unquote. Sorry. Not only did Turley write that Democrats are, quote, now seeking an impeachment for remarks covered by the First Amendment, end quote. Let me just break in here and read the First Amendment Turley is referring to. The First Amendment reads, and this is the part of the First Amendment that refers to what we're talking about. Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Turley explained many Democrats are guilty of the exact same accusations they are throwing at Trump. Turley continued, and I quote, Democrats are pushing this dangerously vague standard while objecting to their own remarks, given new meaning from the critics. Conservatives have pointed out to Maxine Waters, asking her supporters to confront Republicans in restaurants, while Anya Presley insisted amidst the violent marches last year that there needs to be unrest in the streets. And Kamala Harris, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris said, quote, protesters should not let up, unquote. Resumed Turley, quote, even as some of those marches turned violent, they can legitimately argue their rhetoric was not meant to be a call for violence, but this standard is filled with subjectivity. The damage caused by rioters this week was enormous. However, it will pale in comparison to the damage from a new precedent of snap impeachment for speech protected under the First Amendment. It is the very threat that the framers sought to avoid in crafting the impeachment standard, in that being the 25th Amendment. In a process of deliberative judgment, the reference to a snap impeachment is a contradiction. In this new system, guilt is not doubted and innocence is not deliberated. This would do to the Constitution what the violent rioters did to the Capitol and leave it in tatters, end quote, by Jonathan Turley, a professor at George Washington University Law School. This was an article by Chris Enlow from January 10th, 2021, found on theblaze.com. Now, let me bring you an article that is along the same lines, but just came out 10 hours ago as of this broadcast on deadline.com by Ted Johnson, titled, Mike Pence says he won't invoke 25th Amendment to remove Donald Trump. And now, before I bring you this article, let me read the 25th Amendment so you have an understanding. And it's a little lengthy, but if you'll listen, you'll get what I'm trying to bring across here. 25th Amendment, Section 1. In case of the removal of the president from office or his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. Section 2. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. Section 3. Whenever the president transmits to the president pro tempore, or for the time being, of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration of the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. So what they're saying here is that they have the right, if he is unable for whatever reason to do his duties as president, President Trump is more than able to do anything he needs to do, and they know it. Section 4, Amendment 25. Right? 25th Amendment. Section 4. Whenever the vice president, a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the president pro tempore, or for a short time, of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting president. So, once again, going back, it says that whenever the vice president, executive departments, Congress may by law provide, transmit to the president of the Senate, president of the Senate being the vice president now, Pence, and the Speaker of the House, Pelosi, their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers of his duty of the office, the vice president shall immediately assume. The vice president is saying this should not happen, is what's going on. So if they wanted to do this, it would go over to the vice president, who is saying, I don't want this to happen. So anyway, there's more to the 25th Amendment, but it doesn't really apply to what we're talking about. So going on, back to the article from Deadline.com by Ted Johnson, it reads, and I quote, Vice President Mike Pence said that he will not invoke the 25th Amendment to remove Donald Trump from office, saying that he did not think it was in the best interest of our nation or consistent with our Constitution. It's not. We just read that. It's not. Pence's office made public a letter sent to the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Pence's office made public a letter he sent to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, just as the House prepares to vote on a resolution urging him and the cabinet to invoke the amendment. But Pence wrote that, last week, I did not yield to pressure to exert power beyond my constitutional authority to determine the outcomes of the election, and I will not now yield to efforts in the House of Representatives to play political games at a time so serious in the life of our nation. There's too much going on. People, back off. That's ridiculous. Pence said that the 25th Amendment was designed to address presidential incapability or disability, not a means of punishment or usurping the office. Pelosi has said that the House will move on to impeachment if Pence declined to invoke the 25th Amendment. An impeachment vote is likely on Wednesday, charging Trump will incite an insurrection. That's today, by the way. Here is the definition of insurrection. If you don't really understand it, insurgents, rebellion, a violent uprising, usually to overthrow an authority or government. Okay, on with the article. Let's finish this up. Pence did not bring up the possibility of impeachment in his letter, but he wrote that he wanted to urge members of Congress to avoid actions that would further divide and inflame the passions of the movement. So I'm going to read to you the letter from the Vice President of the United States, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and this is that letter. Okay, good. Dear Madam Speaker, every American was shocked and saddened by the attack on our nation's capital last week, and I am grateful for the leadership that you and the congressional leaders provided in reconvening Congress to complete the people's business on that very same day. It was a moment that demonstrated to the American people the unity that is still possible in Congress when it is needed most. But now, with just 8 days left in the president's term, you and the Democratic caucus are demanding that the cabinet and I invoke the 25th Amendment. I do not believe that such a course of action is in the best interest of our nation or consistent with our Constitution. Last week, I did not yield to pressure to exert power beyond my constitutional authority to determine the outcome of the election, and I will not now yield to efforts in the House of Representatives to play political games at a time so serious in the life of our nation. As you know full well, the 25th Amendment was designed to address presidential incapacity or disability. Just a few months ago, when you introduced legislation to create a 25th Amendment Commission, you said, a president's fitness for office, let me quote, Pelosi said, a president's fitness for office must be determined by science and facts, unquote. You said then that we must be, quote, very respectful of not making a judgment on the basis of a commitment or behavior that we don't like, but based on a medical decision, unquote. Madam Speaker, you were right. Under our Constitution, the 25th Amendment is not a means of punishment or usurpation. Invoking the 25th Amendment in such a manner would set a terrible precedent. After the horrific events of this last week, our administration's energy is directed to ensuring an orderly transition. The Bible says, from Vice President Joe Pence, he says, the Bible says that for everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to heal and a time to build up, unquote from the Bible. That time is now, Pence goes on. In the midst of a global pandemic, economic hardship for millions of Americans, and the tragic events of January 6th, now is the time for us to come together. Now is the time to heal. I urge you and every member of Congress to avoid actions that would further divide and inflame the passions of the moment. Work with us to lower the temperature and unite our country as we prepare to inaugurate President-elect Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. I pledge to you that I will continue to do my part to work in good faith with the incoming administration to ensure an orderly transition of power. So help me God. Quoted by and written by Michael R. Pence, the Vice President of the United States, to Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I think Joe Pence says it all, really. I mean, that last part of it especially is like, you know, this country's has gone through a year of all kinds of stuff. And we're still trying to recover and still going through it. It's not only not backed off, it's in a lot of cases getting worse. And now is the time to heal. The verse that I keep saying Joe Pence. I apologize. Vice President Michael Pence has said from the Bible that there's a time to heal and a time to build up. That time is now. So that's about the best I can do for this. In that today is Wednesday, January 13th. Today is the day they're supposed to do this impeachment, and so we'll see what happens. I have to believe that for the most part, most people will not go along with this. I might just end this off by saying, if our president, if Donald Trump is impeached, he will not be able to hold any office ever again. To me, that more than anything else, even if they have to make up whatever reasons they have to make up to impeach him, their whole agenda here, in my opinion, is to make sure that in 4 years, this man doesn't run for office again. Because if the next 4 years don't go well, I'll guarantee you this country is going to bring Donald Trump back as president. That's my opinion. All right. Very good. That's what I got for us all here. So we're going to get on with the show, Contemplating the Constitution. And we're going to talk about some constitutional stuff. And that is Constitution in the News. We'll be right back.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
So help me God. I, Mark David Smith, do solemnly swear that I will give you the best of my research on whatever I'm talking about today. What am I talking about today? All right. Let's see. Last week we talked about Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, the No Preference Clause. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obligated to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. We talked about export preferences and port preferences. And so if you want to hear this specific, my research on this specific article, you're welcome to go to messianicalamnetwork.com, and there you'll find the link to Contemplating the Constitution, and you can hear all of our past. I think there's like 30 some going on 40 recordings now, videos now on the Constitution. So this week I give you my research on Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, and there's two parts of this. There's 7A and 7B. There's a lot on the internet that you can find to research this if you're interested. But let me read this first to get started. Article 1, Section 9, Clause A reads, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. What we have in this instance, this clause, is called the Appropriations Clause, and it's also the Statement and Accounts Clause. Pretty basically, because you have two sections here. The first one that I read, talking about no money shall be drawn, is the Appropriation Clause, and then a regular statement and account makes that the Statement and Account Clause. The first half of Clause 7 being defined as appropriation for our use in this, of course, the definition of appropriation for our use in this article is a sum of money or total assets devoted to a special purpose. So pretty much says it all. It's just a sum of money. It's just an amount given for a specific purpose. In your household, say one person takes care of the money in the household and something is needed to buy to help out the household, then you appropriate that amount of money to a certain person in that household to go buy that product. It's just as simple as that, and it's just the way that Congress works. For my base research outline, I'll be using a couple of articles, one from the constitution.congress.org called Constitution Annotated, and the other from constitutioncenter.org. The article from Constitution Annotated starts off by saying the restriction on drawing money from the Treasury was intended as a restriction upon the dispersing authority of the executive department of Congress, and means simply that no money can be paid out of the Treasury unless it has been appropriated by an act of Congress. Congress may recognize and pay a claim of an equitable, moral, or honorary nature when it directs a specific sum to be paid to a certain person. Neither the Secretary of the Treasury nor any court has discretion to determine whether the person is entitled to receive it. The court has recognized that Congress the court has also recognized that Congress has wide discretion with regard to the extent to which it may prescribe details of expenditures for which it appropriates funds, and has approved the frequent practice of making lump sum appropriations. And in an article from constitutioncenter.org, written by Kate Smith, who is a Lafayette Foster professor of law at Yale School of Law, she writes, "The Constitution places the power of the purse in Congress. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In specifying the activities on which public funds may be spent, Congress defines the contours of federal power. This requirement of legislative appropriation before public funds are spent is at the foundation of our constitutional order. The Appropriations Clause, which is the first part of Clause 7, is not technically a grant of legislative power, because pursuant to the Necessary and Proper Clause, which would be Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, we've covered in past sessions, Congress clearly has the power to specify the objects, amounts, and timing of federal spending, even if there were no appropriations clause. So the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 actually covers this, even if we weren't, this part of it, even if they weren't written into this clause. If Congress could not limit the executive's withdrawing of funds from the Treasury, then the constitutional grants of power to Congress to raise taxes and to borrow money would be for naught, because the executive could, executive being the president, could effectively compel taxing and borrowing by spending at will. So in other words, what they're saying here is that the president withdrawing funds from the Treasury has to be gone through Congress to do whatever he wants to do. He can't just go in and tell Congress, I'm going to do this for this reason. One of those example that comes to my mind on that is during the Iraq War, when we were supposed to go to Congress to get approval to get the money to fight the war, our then president decided to just go to war. And that was a huge issue. Everybody just followed him and we went to war. But that it was also the big issue based on this clause, the appropriations clause. In other words, he did not go through the proper channels, so he violated the Constitution by not getting the money from Congress or them approving that. So anyway, and that comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2. You can go back and read those. They go right along with this. The Appropriations Clause creates a legislative duty that Congress exercise control and assume responsibility over the federal fiscal year. Congress's power of the purse is at the foundation of our Constitution's separations of powers, a constitutionally mandated check on executive power. Once again, that's why we have it in the Constitution, so that the president can't just go take money from the Treasury and say, tell his secretary, go get this money, we're going to go do this. They've got to have a constitutionally mandated check on executive power. The Appropriations Clause would appear to enjoin the president and federal agencies to spend funds only as appropriated by Congress. Once again, even where the president believes that federal spending is urgently needed, spending in the absence of appropriations is constitutionally prohibited. It's exactly what we're talking about. Where an emergency exists, a president may decide that principles more fundamental than the Constitution's appropriations requirement justify spending. For instance, what I just talked about with President Bush and the war on Iraq, he decided that was an emergency. Also, for instance, at the outbreak of the Civil War, with the nation itself at risk, Lincoln ordered the expenditure of $2 million in federal funds before appropriations were funded. He just ordered it to come in. $2 million. Can you imagine back in those days when, we're talking 100-some years ago, when money was, $1 million was everything. People couldn't imagine $1 million like today. They can't imagine $1 trillion. Even billions today are just slightly mentioned. They're like no big deal to say $1 billion anymore. But Lincoln did that $2 million, which today prices probably more like $2 billion. Anyway, so this is supposed to be a check on the executive office by Congress, yet still, even though it's not in the Constitution, the president, the executive office, will invoke his power, and as long as it's done, they don't come against him. Interesting, we're impeaching a president for something he didn't even do right now, and this kind of thing was done, and they never even... Anyway, going on. Despite the imperative of the Appropriations Clause, Congress itself is constitutionally obligated to provide funding necessary for the president to undertake executive powers specifically granted in Article 2. This would be to receive ambassadors, act as commander-in-chief, negotiate treaties, and grant pardons, and the like, which seem to be, except for the act as commander-in-chief, doesn't seem like it should cost a whole lot. If Congress fails to provide necessary funds, then the grants of power to the president just do not work. Scholars disagree on the extent to which Congress may use appropriations limitations to control the president's exercise of discretion in carrying out his or her duty to execute the law, especially in the area of national security, though we all agree that Congress may not, under the guise of exercising the power of the purse, interfere with indispensable executive or judicial functions, nor may the president frustrate congressional mandates by refusing to spend directed funds. The constitutional processes for resolving disagreements or even deadlocks may well be political, but no federal court has ever ordered Congress to appropriate funds for the executive branch or for the judicial branch, whereas federal courts have exercised authority to direct state fiscal operations in order to effectuate federal constitutional guarantees, such as the school busing racial segregation cases. On rare occasions, as in the case of Train versus City of New York City of 1975, federal courts have also intervened to say that a president has no authority to withhold funds. An appropriation is often thought as the specification of an amount of money, but an appropriation is more than a limitation to how much money may be spent. The appropriations required by the Constitution also must specify the powers, activities, and purposes for which the funds may be used. The specification of these objects is sometimes in an Appropriations Act itself, but more usually is the non-appropriations legislation establishing federal agencies or continuing particular programs, often called authorization acts rather than appropriations. Critically, the more creation of an agency or authorization of an activity does not by itself permit expenditure of federal funds. Spending requires another kind of authorization, and that is an appropriation. Congress. So basically what they're saying is there's a difference between authorizing the money and actually coming up with the money, making sure that the money is there. So many times the two words get misused in what they're doing. So, you may not authorize it, but the money's there to take, and they take it anyway. And sometimes it's authorized and then they don't use the money. So it can be used vice versa. Congress has long codified this object requirement, requiring that appropriations shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law. Except as otherwise provided by law refers primarily to a variety of statutes that give executive agencies limited authority to reprogram line items with an appropriation under certain conditions. This practice does not contravene or conflict with the Appropriations Clause because reprogramming authority effectively expands the objects for which the appropriations are made. So what we're talking about here is that if I'm part of Congress and we've decided that we want to do a certain thing for a certain community, and we have to fill out an appropriations act defining all the things that we're going to do and how we're going to use that money. But yet when we get the money, we actually we don't use it for these things and use it over here for other things. You can't do that. You have to be sure that everything is accounted for within the act or the document that you present to Congress that you're using that money for. So what they're saying is that what people will do is they submit that writ of what they want it for, and then they reprogram the objects into using them for something else. Another statute codifies the concept that appropriations must be spent within the time period specified by Congress. The Constitution specifically provides that the duration of appropriations for the Army must be limited to 2 years. We find that specifically in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12, we covered in past sessions. From the first Congress, operating funds for federal agencies have usually been appropriated annually, but larger capital projects may have longer appropriation durations. So things have changed over the years from when the first Congress put all this together. But it still works the same way. There are a variety of other forms of federal spending authority besides statutes called appropriations. For instance, Congress has often authorized agencies to obligate federal funds which have not yet been appropriated. Such obligation authority is necessary because federal agencies, subject to annual appropriations, often must enter into multi-year contracts. There is no violation of the appropriations clause as long as the funds are not paid until appropriated. So what they're talking about is that it's real easy to appropriate funds and then sit on them to use them at a later time. So they put a time limit on the whatever appropriations act you submit. This has to be used in this specific amount of time. And as long as funds are not paid within the appropriated time, you're fine. But Congress can take those funds back if you're not using them. In other statutes, Congress has indefinitely authorized federal agencies to spend treasury funds or special purpose taxes, fees, or forfeitures without separate appropriation of such funds. Such backdoor spending, as it's often called, is usually without limitation as to amount or duration of spending. Payment of interest on the national debt has been indefinitely and permanently appropriated since 1847. Indefinitely meaning no limitation as to amount, and permanently meaning no limitations as to duration. And what this is really saying is that we can borrow money and never pay it back. Never being permanently, pay being indefinitely it back. Statutory entitlement programs such as Social Security, unemployment payments, and certain agriculture subsidies are usually funded by an indefinite and permanent appropriation. So basically what they've done is they've set up things like Social Security, unemployment payments, and certain agricultural subsidies can draw that money as they need it. And they make sure that there is no time limit on it. They have to be able to keep that going as long as the money is there. So I think we all know that Social Security money is will keep going on and on. But if we run out of money, then those of us who draw Social Security won't get it anymore. Okay, let's see. The constitutional function of appropriations made by law, which is a legislative check on the executive branch and the exercise of federal authority, is performed by the creation of the entitlement program and by future Congresses in setting the rates and amounts of agency receipts and payments. At times, Congress has created spending authority not only without amount or time limitations, but also arguably without an effective object limitation, where, for instance, the agency has broad discretionary authority in some particular policy area. In such circumstances, although spending has been approved by Congress, it is not clear that the functional purposes of the Appropriations Clause have been met. There is, for instance, an indefinite permanent appropriation for national intelligence activities, the objects of which are particularly specified in federal statutes. says itself. One questionable form of spending authority is open-ended authority to receive and spend donations and gifts, which Congress has granted to a variety of federal agencies, including the State Department. It's just like the donations and gifts. There's no ending on it. It's all the time. It's forever, and it has no limit to it. So they can just whatever they want to give on donations and gifts, $2 billion, and take it right out of the treasury to give to somebody for some reason. It's there. It's just wide open. Loan guarantees and insurance schemes like mortgages backed by the Federal Home Loan Banks function outside the appropriations process, notwithstanding the federal financial liability incurred. Until recently, the Federal Reserve was the only federal agency that has been given permanent plenary authority to set its own budget without congressional oversight. This approach has been justified because of the need to have a politically independent agency in charge of monetary fiscal policy. It says itself. Congress effectively gave the same authority to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by requiring the Federal Reserve to fund it. Therefore, there have been recent efforts to subject that agency to the usual annual appropriations process. So what they're talking about here in all of this, in the appropriations, is that it is a way to get authorization, approval. You submit, whoever you are, the president or House of Representatives, the senators, Congress itself, all of that, come up with a project and they want to fund that, then you get authorization through an appropriations act, and then that money comes out of there. But it is, by what they're doing, they're keeping track of all of this. Now, that's the second part of this Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Is Part B is more aptly called the Clause 7B, the Statement and Accounts Clause, which complements the requirement appropriation. And as we read at the beginning, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. Like the appropriations requirement, this requirement states not a power, but a legislative duty that has been interpreted to require an annual budget. Justice Story was an American lawyer and jurist who served on the Supreme Court of the United States from 1812 to 1845. He is most remembered for his magisterial commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. He wrote about this specific clause, and I quote, excuse me, "The power to control and direct the appropriations constitutes a most useful and salutary check upon profusion and extravagance, as well as upon corrupt influence and public speculation. And to make the responsibility complete and perfect, a regular account of the receipts and expenditures is required to be published, that the people may know what money is expended and for what purposes and by what authority," unquote. Since the founding era, Congress has largely delegated its duty under the Statement and Accounts Clause to executive branch agencies such as the Treasury Department and the Office of Management and Budget. Those agencies have failed to include or report in full on a variety of backdoor federal spending programs, federal insurance liabilities, and spending and borrowing by semi-autonomous federal entities. Certain national security spending is also excluded from the annual budget process. While the Congressional Budget Office and Government Accountability Office seek to provide further budget accountability as agents of the legislative branch, the Statement and Accounts Clause has de facto fallen in the purview of the executive or the president. The two requirements discussed here are not self-enforcing and likely do not judicially are not likely judicially enforceable. They are only as good as Congress's determination to abide by them. So what we have is the ability to appropriate, meaning that a sum of money set aside for a specific thing, object, or progress that you want to do if you're in Congress or the President of the United States. And then it's supposed to be held accountable. Once it is approved, it's authorized, it should be held accountable. But as they're saying, what I'm actually saying is that if it's never ending, it doesn't really have a time limit, and you don't have a set amount. If it's either one of those different things, which should be in every Appropriations Act that they put together, if it's not there, then it's not kept track of, and there goes our money, and that's about it right there. But anyway, there was Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7A and B, and how all that works. And I hope it was interesting to you. It's always very interesting to me. I wish 30 years ago I had started looking into this 30, 40 years ago and learned about this. I would be a smarter human. That's all there is to it. So once again, I hope you're enjoying this as we contemplate the Constitution. And this is my research. Once again, there is a massive amount of information about every single item in the Constitution out there. It's been written about over and over and over again, and there's a lot of documented facts about it over and over and over again on the internet. You just have to look it up. One of the best ways to do it is just put, for instance, if you want to know more about what I just showed you my research on, if you'll type in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, just type that in there. You'll see page after page after page come up on all of that, all the information on that and what different people have put together, including government document sites. The government itself has got a lot of detailed instruction on each and every clause, article, section, amendment that there is in the Constitution. So anyway, I don't even have a clue how far along we are. I haven't even looked to see what else is there. We're just going through it piece by piece by piece. And so there you have it. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Next week, I'll give you my research on the final clause of Section 9, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, which reads, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office or of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, except of any present enrollment office or title of any kind whatsoever, from any king, prince, or foreign state." Basically, this clause will state that rejecting the monarchy of England, the Constitution also specifically prohibits Congress from granting a title of nobility to any person and prohibits public officials from accepting a title of nobility, office, or gift from any foreign country or monarch without congressional approval. There's a whole lot more to it than that. But that's next week here on Contemplating the Constitution. Thank you very much for joining me. Once again, I hope it's interesting to you. And on MessianicLambNetwork.com or MessianicLambRadio.com, you can go on Contemplating the Constitution page and find a lot of videos. 30 plus, I think getting close to 40 videos of what we've already talked about here in order as we did the research on this. So you're welcome to go back and take a look at any or all of them. Binge watch them. We've got some good ones, some real interesting ones on different subjects. So there you go. God bless, and thank you so much for joining us on Contemplating the Constitution.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.